Maybe?
Oh, yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, I am greatly honored to do this introduction of Michael Bamberger. And I don't have any script on your bio right now, Michael, but it's, I think everybody here knows, the nature of your work, and your commitment to evaluation. And the work you've done extensively on social development as it ties to evaluation. I think you're one of those people who really tries to ground evaluation, not in its high-level technical, gold standard system, but where it matters the most, with people and with the key issues that need to be addressed in development. And evaluation then supports that process. So we're very happy to have you actually today to share with us. You've agreed to focus on the issue of consequences, unintended consequences, and a bit of complexity. So we're open to, listening to you and to engaging in a dialogue on this particular issue. And we're hoping this is the start of several more sessions, whenever you visit the New York area. So we're very honored to have you here with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, how I was planning to organize the time, this presentation is about 25, maximum 30 minutes on the unanticipated consequences, and then however much time you'd like to spend on questions and discussion of that. And then if there is any time left, I just prepared a few slides on evaluating complex development interventions, because I know that's an area of importance to you, and we may or may not have much time to get into that, depending on when you need to leave and how much discussion we get into. But I'm going to be back in New York from time to time. I'm working as an evaluator, as the advisor to the evaluation department of the Rockefeller Foundation now, so I sort of come here from time to time. So nice to see you. Some old faces, well, not old faces, but faces I've known for a long time. Young faces I've known for a long time. I selected this topic of the unanticipated consequences of development interventions, a blind spot for evaluation theory and practice, because I continually observed in the work which I do and confirm with other people that evaluation as a profession doesn't seem to be very good at identifying unanticipated and often negative consequences of development interventions. There are cases, obviously, where this is adequately addressed, but there are just many cases where it's not. Many evaluations come up with a glowing report on how good the project was, how much it benefited the target group, and very often there were some quite serious negative consequences, which I'll give some examples, which were never mentioned in the evaluation, including cases of women ending up in hospital because they'd been beaten unconscious by their husband for going to a meeting for a microcredit program without his permission, and the evaluation report was just interviewing the beneficiaries, how their lives had been changed when they got small loans, and no mention of the fact that literally people were in hospital because of this project for daring to go to a meeting without their husband's permission. So this is something which I've been sort of thinking and worrying about for quite a long time, of why it is that evaluation as a profession doesn't seem to be too good at addressing, identifying and addressing the negative consequences. Now, I hasten to say there are many evaluations which do this very well, but there's a very large number which don't. So that's what I'd like to talk about. And when I originally prepared this presentation, which I gave at IPDET in Carleton University, I was focusing more at the project level, and I've tried to modify this a little bit because I know that a lot of your work is mainly at the broader policy level, looking at country programs and so on. So a lot of this, the focus directly is on the project level, but as you see, the implications are relevant for the broader level as well. So the first point I'd just like to make is that it doesn't come to a surprise to anyone who's been working in development that very few development interventions work out exactly as planned. outcomes in even well-designed projects tend to be unpredictable. One of the reasons is that most programs are proposing relatively simple, relatively linear solutions to complex problems. So you're just taking one aspect of a complex situation and trying to produce a change. And very often the things which you were not addressing can affect the outcomes so that you get some unintended consequences. But also, even if your program is well designed and implemented, human behavior is difficult to predict. How people will respond to your program. So you can have a program which is planned and delivered in exactly the same way in different contexts with very different outcomes because of the response of the intended beneficiaries. And then, as we all know, programs operate in complex environments where there are many economic, social, psychological, historical, ecological factors which affect the program. So again, the same program in different contexts can work quite differently. And then program planners and even more so evaluators have much less control than they hope or sometimes think they have. So the way programs are actually designed and implemented is to quite a large extent outside the control of the implementing agency in many contexts. And then the unanticipated outcomes increase as programs become more complex. If you're trying to evaluate the country programs of multi-donor collaborative initiatives, the likelihood of unexpected outcomes increases. Now, unexpected outcomes are not always negative. You can have lots of good things happen, which communities take their own initiative and modify a project so it has different kinds of outcomes than had been expected. So you can have positive outcomes, but very, very often the negative consequences, the unexpected consequences will be negative. So that's something we'll be thinking about. So the second point I'd like to ask is why are evaluators still surprised when programs don't work out as intended? It seems in many cases that these unanticipated outcomes still catch both planners and evaluators by surprise. And in many cases, these important unanticipated outcomes, many of which have some very serious consequences, are not even detected in the evaluation. So the question I'll be thinking about is why is this? When you talk to people, everyone can give examples of programs which didn't go as expected, but why does this not systematically get integrated into evaluation designs and implementation? Here's just a couple of examples, 3 examples of some serious negative outcomes which were not captured by the evaluations. The first one I've already mentioned was the Food for Work program in Central America, where some women ended up in hospital because of having been beaten up for wishing to participate in the program without their husband's permission. And all of the evaluation was meeting with the community groups, and they're getting very glowing reports of how this program had changed their lives. And the evaluation report didn't mention all of these negative consequences. They'd only been focusing on the beneficiaries and not other sectors of the population. A second example, this was the slum upgrading project it's actually in the Philippines, in the Tondo Foreshore. Before the project began, a couple of years before it began, people who had political context knew that there was going to be a major upgrading program in Tondo and that the value of the land would go up. So they actually forced people out of Tondo, sometimes at gunpoint. So 2 years before the project officially began, all of the most important changes, the negative consequences for the project in the sense of poor people who were intended to benefit were already forced out of the project, happened before the evaluation, before the project began, before the evaluation began. So the evaluation tried to measure from the baseline very carefully to make sure that people who lived in Tondo when the project began were still there 3 years later, because it was a goal to benefit the original population. The evaluation again said, this was very good. Nobody had moved, the project was successful. They didn't even know that the poor people had been forced out 2 years earlier. Didn't get mentioned in the evaluation. Then just a third example, a road construction project in East Africa. This was with the World Bank, and there was the loan agreement was that all families who had to be moved for the road construction would be compensated. So before the first supervision mission, the government came in and threw out a lot of families, just demolished their houses, so they wouldn't have to pay compensation. But again, this happened before the evaluation began, so it wasn't reported in the evaluation. So those are just a few examples of some quite serious negative consequences. And I'd like to keep repeating, I'm not saying this is always the case, but there's just many situations where these consequences are not detected. So I'd like to just think briefly about why evaluations are often unable to detect these unanticipated consequences. A first reason is that funders of the programs and the evaluations are often mainly interested to know whether the program has achieved its intended outcomes, and they don't pressure evaluators to look for the negative outcomes. They're happy the program has achieved what it intended to, and you very often hear, if you're an evaluator, we want you to do a really rigorous evaluation, but this is not the moment to rock the boat, because our negotiations with the government of Indonesia, for example, are quite sensitive, and a negative evaluation report wouldn't help at the moment. So often donors are not really pushing evaluators to look at these negative outcomes. And then there's a range of the real-world constraints of budget, time, difficulties of access to data, political, organizational constraints. So that's another set of factors which limit the focus of the evaluation. But more interestingly, I think that many evaluation designs make it difficult to identify unanticipated outcomes. So I think this is, when I talk about the blind spot for evaluation, it's the kind of thing I was thinking about. So many theories of change and logic models are basically designed to explain how the project is expected to work, and many of them don't identify what might be some of the negative outcomes. And so if you rigorously follow through your logic model or your theory of change, often it doesn't give you any guidelines for looking at unanticipated consequences. It will tell you if you didn't achieve the objective you're intending to achieve, but it won't tell you about the women ending up in hospital, because that doesn't come into your theory of change. The same with a lot of the results frameworks, that they're monitoring the intended outcomes, they're not looking, they don't have any way of documenting unintended outcomes. So these are sort of structural issues, I think, with some of the quite widely used evaluation methods. Then if you look at a lot of quantitative evaluation designs, then where you have a pre-test, post-test design, they're designed to measure whether the intended outcomes are achieved, and then to do all of your statistical analysis of attribution analysis and so on. But they don't include questions on unanticipated outcomes usually. So this is repeated in a slightly different way in this first point. Many of these surveys don't even give respondents an opportunity to mention other things. Often there's a blank space where you could give other comments, but very often the respondent is not encouraged to do that. The people doing the programming of the analysis don't like it if you have a lot of open-ended questions. So often, even if a respondent said, well, I'd like to tell you about some real problems we had with this program, because it resulted in land invasion and other communities wanting to get access to our water supply, there may not be anywhere to report that in your survey. Theoretically you could, but very often, particularly if you come in with a large survey and the respondent's thinking it's going to be an hour before this interview gets through with this, the last thing you want is to start getting into other areas which are going to take more time. So lots of the quantitative survey instruments don't really give an opportunity to discuss the unintended consequences. They could, but they very often don't. Then again, many structured surveys have difficulties in identifying and interviewing vulnerable groups. Often they just get missed. They're not covered. They're harder to detect. They're more expensive to interview. Often they're people who run away. They don't want to be interviewed because they don't have documentation. They could be chased out of the community by the police. So again, these groups will often not get covered. Then focus groups very often tend to mainly cover people who are involved in the project, or people who were intended to be involved in the project, but they're only asked about why didn't they get involved in the project. And a lot of focus groups, they have a very strict protocol that they follow, that you don't deviate from the questions which are in the protocol. You could, but just if you look at many focus groups, they are very precisely scripted, so they don't tend to capture, you know, a lot of these issues. Then a final point which came from the presentation which Indra and Sukayo were putting together on your thinking on complex evaluations. Many development evaluations focus too much on the internal concerns and procedures of their own agency. They have a sort of tunnel vision. The agency wants to know, are we doing a good job? Are we following our procedures? And so very often they don't focus sufficiently on the national development context. What is it that the host government, the civil society in South Africa or Bangladesh would like to get out of this program? So a lot of evaluations can be introspective, just asking the question, is our organization doing a good job operationally? So those are a few of the factors within evaluation designs which can limit the ability to capture these unintended consequences. And then another very important set of factors is that many of these unanticipated events occur outside the vision of the evaluation, that they fall under the radar screen. Sometimes these events occur before the evaluation began, the example of people being forced to sell their houses in Tondo. Sometimes they take place when the evaluator is not there, at night, during the rainy season when nobody ever goes to evaluate projects, in the privacy of the household. So very often the evaluation is only focusing on what happens in public spaces during certain hours. So lots of very important things. You know, the woman goes to the meeting and she learns all about how to run her own business. Then she goes home and her husband says, you know, no way, no, I'm not having my wife walking down the street and all of these men looking at her. But you don't know that because this happens in the house. Then other critical events occur after the evaluation ended, particularly issues of sustainability. You have a beautiful school. If anybody went back 2 years later, you'd see it was abandoned because the roof was leaking, all of the books have been stolen, the windows are broken. But that's after the evaluation is finished, so it doesn't capture that. Then many quantitative evaluations, they're only observing 2 specific points of time. When you do your baseline, your pretest study, and when you come back 3 years later. And many evaluations have no contact whatsoever with the community between these 2 points of time. The evaluation consultants flew in from another country. They used a consultant firm which has a specific number of days assigned to the evaluation. And just the amazing things can happen during those 3 years. There's land invasions, a change of government, the project gets completely changed, and the evaluation has no information on that. They just know the baseline and the post-test. So these are some of the factors in terms of what the evaluators look at and what they don't. Then many evaluators also don't look at the context. It's almost as if this project had been lowered from the Mars and put into this space, and that not in any way affected by what was going on in the community, in the district, in the country. So many evaluations really don't look at the context in which programs are operating. Then another very critical factor is that budget constraints mean that very often you don't get to interview the poorest, the most vulnerable people who live furthest away from the community centre. We'd have loved to interview them, but unfortunately our budget didn't allow us to do this. So you just end up interviewing the sort of middle income groups in the community who are easy to get access to. And I was working recently with some Japanese evaluators in the north of Vietnam, and none of them, it was an adult education program, none of the Hmong were interviewed because they lived about 4 hours walk from the community centre where most of the interviews were being taken place. They said, we'd have loved to interview the Hmong, but our budget didn't allow us to do that. So you come up with generalizations about how successful this adult education program is with no information of some of the groups who had most difficulties with the project. So this is very common. No one has time to get in a boat and and go out and find the people in the remote areas. Evaluators don't like riding on donkeys and so on. So you very often, big sectors of the population get left out from many evaluations. So I think why we should worry, that's sort of fairly self-evident, so I won't dwell on that. But just one point is that important lessons don't get learned about the project if you're missing a lot of things which are happening. Then the final section of this very rapid overview is what can be done. I don't want to give the impression that things are hopeless. So I'd like to acknowledge that a lot of these ideas in this section were developed together with Jonathan Morel. He has a very interesting recent book on the evaluation in the face of uncertainty, anticipating surprise and responding to the inevitable. So what can be done? And the message is there is hope. And so firstly, it's helpful to understand the nature of the unexpected. There are different types of surprises. There are some surprises which can be anticipated and addressed. For example, if you're organizing a scholarship program for girls, we know a lot about how those work, and there's a lot of the potentially unintended consequences which can be anticipated and addressed. There's other kinds of surprises that could be planned for and detected. They're not so well known, but it would be possible to identify those and study. And this is the area where more work could be done of thinking more systematically how you would identify these consequences. And then there's surprises which it's very difficult to anticipate. The tsunami, civil war, although a lot of civil wars can be anticipated. So there's a lot of things like that which would be very difficult to anticipate. And the other concept related to this is that the probability and the magnitude of surprises varies a great deal from one kind of intervention to another. For example, the level of innovation in a program, if you're moving into uncharted territory, there's likely to be many more unanticipated consequences than if this is the 15th transport project in Indonesia, where you have a pretty good idea of the things which may happen. Then the nature of the interventions which are intended to cause behavioral change are likely to have more unanticipated outcomes than something which is providing a specific service. The fidelity to the design protocol, how strictly does the program design and implementation follow the plan? This is when you get into issues like decentralization, where you have a lot of different agencies implementing a project, you're likely to get more deviations from the plan and more unexpected outcomes. The robustness of the program in different settings. Some programs are very context sensitive. They work well in one area, they don't work well in another, so there's more risk of unexpected outcomes. Others are more robust and work in a lot of different contexts. A lot of the conditional cash transfers, for example, they vary in exactly how they operate, but they tend to be fairly robust in a lot of contexts. Whereas if you're in an HIV/AIDS prevention program for injecting drug users, this can be very context specific. If you're doing this in Cambodia, which I was involved with recently, a completely different situation than if you're doing it in Brazil. Then your level of understanding of the program context is obviously important. And then finally, the time between the intervention and the estimation of outcomes. If this is a program over many years, there's much more opportunity for things to change and go off in different directions. Secondly, there's just about another 3 slides. Secondly, some of the ways to try to foresee and address unanticipated outcomes. Using a theory-based evaluation approach where you're spelling out very systematically all of the mechanisms through which change is supposed to take place, the linkages, spelling out very specifically the assumptions and continually testing these as the program evolves, gives you a much better framework for seeing if things are going on off track at an early stage and beginning to explore which way that goes. One thing which is important here, many organizations have a beautiful theory of change, and they spend more time of doing the graphics of how you represent this. Once it's done, it's put in a drawer, nobody ever uses it again. So that's not a theory of change. The theory of change is where every few months you go back and say, we thought that if we had separate training programs for men and women, this would have a greater effect on empowering women than if they were in with men in a particular culture. Did that happen? So actually testing out your assumptions. Then the systematic use of past experience. Many people designing projects assume this is the first project in the world which has ever tried to organize microcredit or whatever it's doing. And very often nobody finds out what has been the experience of the, in this particular community or district. Maybe there were 3 attempts in the past which were very negative, the outcomes. This is going to have a big influence on how people perceive your new project. So understanding past experiences is very important, and learning this from the communities through participatory consultations, not just by talking to the minister. Then trying to break down complex programs into smaller components which can be easier to evaluate. So I call it unpacking programs. Makes it easier to capture things which are going off track. Then there's a lot of forecasting methods which are used by planners, which evaluators could use more. Different kinds of simulations, for example, of coming up with different scenarios. And then a final point here is a broader definition of the role of monitoring. Rather than having monitoring as a form of bookkeeping, train your monitors to be very proactive. When the monitoring data shows that something's happening which you don't understand, actually having the monitors as part of their work, going out and trying to understand the reasons for this. So monitoring can be a very powerful tool, which tends to be very underrated by evaluators. Many evaluators look upon people who do monitoring as an inferior form of human life, and often they don't even talk to the monitors, don't even realize there's a monitoring system which is producing a lot of the information they wanted. So monitoring, as we all know, should be a very integral part of an evaluation system. Then what we call trying to develop an agile evaluation, which is very flexible and can adapt. In the next slide, which I think is the final slide, always have a plan B. What are you going to do if you can't implement the evaluation the way that you expected? Most evaluations don't have a plan B. If things don't go according to how you expected, you can't do your baseline when you wanted, you're just going to panic and say, it's not fair, how can we do an evaluation if the world changes? So have your plan B, expecting the world is going to change, and what are you going to do? And I'll just give some examples in the penultimate slide, is 2 more. Then flexibility in terms of how you collect data. If the plan you're going to use doesn't work, what are the other ways that you could collect the data? Then something which is critical is having a flexible evaluation design that can rapidly adapt to changing circumstances. Projects change, the context in which they're operating changes. Can the evaluation adapt? For example, you have a scholarship program for girls, and you change the criteria in the second year of who is eligible. Many evaluations don't even know that has happened, and they don't have the flexibility to adapt. So this is critical, the flexibility in evaluations, which is very difficult to build into a strong quantitative design. Part of the basic concept is that the measurement doesn't change. Then dynamic monitoring, as we've already mentioned, unpacking programs into separate but closely linked components which you can analyze component by component. The constant review of your program theory to be looking at what is changing and making sure you're understanding that and following it. Then the famous plan B. Some of the things that you commonly occur which you need to be thinking about in your evaluation design. What will you do if the program begins before you've done your baseline study, which in my experience happens very, very commonly because there's tremendous operational pressure to start giving out food to get kids into school. There's not the same kind of pressure to do your baseline study. So very often the program starts before you've done your baseline study. What do you do about this? Which is very critical. What happens when your comparison group vanishes? It gets integrated into the project, there's a flood, there's a urban renewal, you build a road through your comparison group. what do you do to, firstly to be aware that's happened, and then to come up with an alternative? What happens when the program is restructured? You had a scholarship program to get girls to go to school. The second year they realized a lot of girls couldn't get to school because there wasn't any transport. So the second year you build in a transport component into the project. Can your evaluation adapt to the fact that in the second year the program is significantly different? What happens if essential data is not available, particularly if you feel that someone's deliberately withholding it from you? It'll be ready next week, and then next week it's not ready. What can you do about that? Then finally, what I call the eyes wide open evaluation. And I use this term because many evaluators, they have their nose in their questionnaire and they don't have any idea what is going on outside the very narrow scope of the data they're collecting. So this is knowing what is really happening on the ground. So try and find out about critical events that took place before the evaluation or the program officially began. And mention the example of the forced sale of land. There's quite a few situations like that. You need to know about that. Many evaluators say, well, it'd be nice to do that, but our evaluation hadn't started then. There's many ways that you can go and reconstruct the past. It's critical. Then use diverse sources of information inside and outside the program to make sure that the evaluator knows what everybody else in the country knows. I've seen many evaluations where everybody says, well, of course this program wasn't going to work because there was a change of government, or there was major conflicts with land invasions because of all of the refugees coming in from the neighbouring country. And often the evaluators are the only people in the country who didn't know that these things have happened, literally. Particularly when the evaluator flies in and teaches people how to do focus groups, you fly out again, you don't come back to the end of the project. So this is critical. Then check what kinds of information you're getting, from whom, and who you're not meeting. You may find that if the government is helping to set up your meetings, certain kinds of organizations just don't turn up. I was doing an evaluation in Malaysia, and we got the government quite a long time ago to very reluctantly agree to invite NGOs to come to the workshops. No NGOs turned up. The government actually said, we were sorry, we tried to get NGOs to come, but there aren't any NGOs in Malaysia. So if you think this is happening deliberately, just to be aware of that and think that there's obviously limits, and you can't just say to the government, hey, we're going to go out and visit these people even if you don't want us to. But the first thing is just sort of being aware it's happening, and then trying to see what you can do about it. A good example is focus groups. Who's coming to the focus groups? Are they all sent by the government? Are they all sent by the opposition? Are they just the middle class ladies who've got time to come along and talk about childcare because they've got 3 maids at home and none of the poor women come? Then the final point is developing creative ways to get information on and about non-beneficiaries and the groups who are worse off. This is a major challenge. It's very difficult to identify these people. Often nobody wants you to talk to them necessarily. But this is critical. There's so many evaluations just miss what should be the central group for your program, the most vulnerable, the poorest, maybe the handicapped, it may be certain categories of women, it may be ethnic minorities. Just so often they get left off of the evaluation because it's difficult to identify them. People are putting roadblocks in your way when you try to talk to them. So just have creative ways, and when we sit around this table, each of you could suggest many creative ways of getting to these groups, but just making sure this is sort of built into the evaluation. So I'll stop there, and these are just a few thoughts on why worrying about unintended consequences is an important issue for us. So now you can tell me this never happens in UNDP.
Only positive ones.
Of course, yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think we open it. It's quite a sobering thing, you know. I'm sitting here thinking, my goodness, talk about type 1 error, type 2 error, you know, and what do you report on issues of validity? So it's very serious,
Yes.
you know, and even us evaluators, we're not immune to realities on the ground.
Yes.
So I think it opens it up for a rich discussion. So perhaps we open it for people to, you know, if there are any reactions or points that they want to reinforce or questions. Michael?
Never invite Michael Bamberger to come back again.
Yeah.
No.
No, I'd say this is extremely interesting, very timely as well, as we're looking at these things, because we're having the peer review looking at our methodology, and this is the kind of issue that I think we need to examine. Somewhere in our guidance it says we pick up the intended and unintended, and that's all it says, and we don't. And that's why this is so important. And I think, if anything, I was joking about, you know, only positive consequences of UNDP, because we don't identify the unintended consequences, through our own work, we tend to get pointed in that direction by our country officers,
Right,
who
yes.
only tell us the positive ones,
Right.
and therefore we tend to have a strong bias in that direction. But this is really helpful. I mean, I think some of the issues related to us as evaluators, we're also trying to address in the new ways that we're going to be working in terms of us taking a bigger lead in doing the evaluations, but also in the move we've taken recently to using many more national consultants. Although, you know, you infer to the problems that we train them, tell what to do, and then we leave, and you know they may be making the same mistakes that we make. But no, in terms of context, I think we moved away from parachuting 3 internationals into a country. That I'm sure is going to help. But I think, you know, the unintended consequences, the lack of understanding of context, the lack of taking that into account, I think these are all things that we need to, you know, address, and we'll be looking at the next few months as we reform our ADRs, at least in the ADR.
Oscar?
Yes, thank you very much, and apologies for being late and missing the beginning of the presentation. It's indeed a very enlightful presentation. We have a challenge here because our unit of analysis are not projects.
Yes.
And so our evaluations are by nature more aggregate. And when we assess a country program document, it's about 40 to sometimes 100 projects.
Yes. Yes.
So this aggregate nature really makes a little bit more difficult to fully apply all this very important ideas, particularly the theory-based evaluation.
Yes.
Since trying we have identified that one of the weaknesses of why even the intended results are not achieved is because the results framework and the strategic intent is very poorly formulated. And it's formulated in such a way that it replicates what is the mandate of UNDP in certain areas and what is the strategic orientation of UNDP corporately, and in a copy-paste approach, many country offices adapt their program documents and the results framework for a 4-year period of time. And therefore, really trying to identify a rationale of how change should happen and to follow that rationale is extremely difficult. And we didn't even try to make any of those interesting graphics or that we sometimes see in theory of change models. So if you could perhaps help us to deal with this aggregated nature of the evaluation. That would be extremely helpful.
Well, do we take one more question? Okay.
Yeah, this is actually following from what Oscar has been saying. We have this theory of change which is given for UNDP, and often, as Oscar mentioned, they have this theory of change at the beginning of the program, and it evolves as the program moves on because the context changes. And we begin with the theory of change which was at the beginning of the evaluation, and somewhere we have difficulties in capturing this evolving nature of the program and how the theory of change has been changing. That's one issue. And the second one comes in terms of how the different outputs and outcomes of different projects have been aggregated and how do we capture it. And considering compared to the bank and other huge bilateral programs, UNDP program scope is very limited. So when we talk about unintended changes, how much of that can we attribute to the UNDP's component, because which often can be very small, and even if it's large, it's relatively very small compared to what's happening at the national level. In that context, we have sometimes difficulty in how do we go about looking at the unintended consequences, negative or positive.
Right.
As Mike said, we have it in our methodology manual, but have difficulties in terms of how we actually capture this when we go about it. The third problem I would like to say is we also have some difficulties in terms of reaching out to the beneficiaries. We somewhere, because we are focusing on results evaluation, we think it's enough to maybe interview district level officials or district level actors, but not often going to the communities, although we have been now trying to get some surveys done at the community level. But in terms of a method that has been a limitation, your thoughts on this would be useful for us. Okay, thank you.
I'll leave you with those two to start with. Yeah.
Okay, so well, thank you. They're very interesting questions. I give a workshop every year with Frans Lou from the Ministry of Justice in Holland on evaluating complex programs. So if we had more time, we've got some more details. We could go into that. And chapter 16 of the book is on evaluating complex programs. So this is, as you well know, it's not an easy thing to do. I think one approach, which is, if you have the resources and the time, is unpacking complex programs with many different components into different components. And for example, if you're working, say, I'm just taking an example of a program which is working with a particular ministry, which may just be one component of your national program. If you look at the whole program, you say that, there's no way we could evaluate this because it's got financial reforms, installing computers, community training groups, recruiting different kinds of teachers. But very often you can identify some different components, and particular components you may be able to evaluate more systematically. Like, for example, looking at the effects of teacher training on certain outcomes, school enrollment, test scores, or whatever. So sometimes if you break programs down, obviously if you've got 60, 70 different components, you can't do that with all of them, but sometimes you can combine them, or sometimes certain of these components are the most critical, or you just, if they're all of equal importance, you select several of them randomly or in some way which people feel would be useful. So I think that's sort of important of a sort of reality testing, because if you're trying to evaluate the whole complex, you tend to be just doing that at the national level, looking at documents and talking to people in head offices. But if you at least make some effort to start getting down to the state level, the district level, the community level, you find, you begin to start getting some idea of what's happening. That what you're told in the Jakarta, nobody in the municipal level even had heard about this. So if you get down to that level, you start learning things, or that it wasn't working at the community level in the way which people thought it would, or that you did the training at the community level but it didn't seem to have any effect. So I think a sort of first rule is trying to get some way of getting a sort of manageable components to look at, and then you have to try to repackage them all, but also trying to get down as far as you can to the community level, or at least to the municipality or the district, just because very often what you've heard in the capital is just completely different. Nobody's heard about this, the plans haven't got down there yet. So I think that's a sort of basic idea of trying to get a handle on something which can be measured, because so many people say, it's got so many components, there's no way you could even begin to think about evaluating, and I think you can. So if you're able to look a little bit more systematically at several components, and if you begin to find there are some systematic patterns of communication weaknesses, or that this particular ministry doesn't seem to be able to handle participatory consultations with communities, or that women never get involved, or that the ethnic minorities never seem to be involved, you may be able to begin to detect some general patterns which you can then begin to explore again at the high level. So you start at the top, and you identify some of the things, like through maybe a theory of change, what's supposed to happen in different components of the program, work your way down to the bottom, and then start working your way up again. Did these funds, which are now available for community participation in road planning, were they there? Could anybody ever use them? So I think that's just a fairly sort of basic thing to try to do. And you can use sometimes a theory of change to try and spell out both what individual components are trying to do, but then how they're supposed to link together at the higher level. So I think a theory of change doesn't have to be very sophisticated, but it sort of gives you some way of thinking what you're trying to look at. And one of the things I found with many agencies is a great reluctance to actually get down to the field level. It's time for some people who've been doing evaluation, sitting in your hotel for a long time. It's a real pain, have to go out and go off to a village. It takes a lot of time. But just every organisation has different reasons why you can't go down to the community level. We just work at the national level, and I say, well, if you're working at the national level, you have no idea whether this is having any effects lower down. Is that something you should be worrying about? And so I think now, as we all know, going to a community doesn't mean having an organised circus where there's you spend all the time having tea with the headman and you're carefully shepherded round, so you only see the people who are happy. And that's a whole other conversation of how you can make a field visit useful. But I think it's critical to always try and have some kind of, some people call grounded theory or reality testing, to know what is happening, because almost all policies, however abstract they seem to be, are going to have some effects lower down. If it's an international trade policy, it's going to have some effect on people in the markets. Are they going to be able to get access to these cheap imports, or is it just going to the big supermarkets? Legal reform, police reform, whatever it is, it's supposed to be producing some changes at different levels. And so finding some way of looking at that. Maybe it's not somebody coming in from New York, it may be local consultants, NGOs, but I think that's critical. It always depresses me how many organisations have very convincing reasons why they can't do that. People often look at me and they say, it's okay for you academics worrying about what happens at the community level, but we work with X organisation, we worry about the big things, in promoting economic growth. Do you know if it has any effect on? No. So I think that's important. And packaging to try and get manageable components. Something else which I think is just one final point that which is important is the terms of reference that you give to your consultants, if you're using consultants, even if you're only sending people to a country for a week, a short period of time, to specifically put into their terms of reference that they have to have a way of identifying people who don't benefit from the program or who might not benefit, that it's not acceptable to only go to the village and talk to all of the ladies who are so happy because their life has been transformed because they've started up a market garden. That's important to know, but and put this up front in the terms of reference, and if the consultants say we can't do that within the time available, either you look for other consultants or you rethink whether the time is realistic, which is often the I've talked to many organisations where they know it can't be done. Somebody was doing an evaluation in Mongolia. Everybody knew you were going to spend half of your time just trying to get plane travel, and everybody knew that. But they sort of smile and say, "Well, in our organisation, it's very difficult to change things," and so that may be the case. But just thinking realistically within the context of your organisation, how you can require the consultants to look more systematically. If they're only spending a day in a village, they have to spend some of that time planning ahead, so they're going to get to see various different groups. And you're not just looking for trouble. It may be lots of really good things. In some programs, branch off in all sorts of different directions and do really good things which you don't detect because it wasn't in your original log frame. But many evaluators would love to have the opportunity to do this. Some just want an easy life, and they're just very happy to spend half the day having tea and the village leaders. But many are driven crazy by the fact that the agency they're working with doesn't give them the opportunity to do this. And a lot of them have learned that if they suggest that you need more money and time, somebody else gets a contract. So it's much easier to say, sure, we can do this rigorous impact evaluation, only talking to beneficiaries. So it's not just wicked evaluators who don't understand or don't want to do this. It's giving them the opportunity to do it, and then thinking through, are you giving them enough time? One day in a village, there's no way you can know enough about what's going on. And one interesting little detail I've seen in various organizations are just these sort of administrative challenges of doing things like this. I've suggested to a lot of bilaterals that they could greatly increase the efficiency of their international consultants if they could hire a local researcher to prepare the ground, to actually go and identify people who might come to focus groups, some of the background context, who are the key informants. And a lot of organizations say, that would be really great, but in our organization it would take 9 months for the procurement to have a local researcher for 2 weeks. It just can't be done. But I found that it can be done, because if you really want to do it, there are just administrative things that you don't call them a consultant, you call them an administrative assistant or something or other. So it can be difficult and it's a pain to do. But if you think you're paying a consultant however much for the airfare and per diems and whatever, and you can hire a really competent local researcher for a month, you're paying a consultant for 1 day when you put in the airfares. And so just finding a way of doing that, it just greatly increases the efficiency of what you're doing. So you arrive in the village and there's somebody saying, there's three main groups in this village, these are some of the issues, the people who are going to come to this first focus group, these are who they are, we couldn't get these people to come to the focus group, all of those kinds of things. Here's some key informants. When we were looking at this Food for Work program, the key informant we were able to track down was the district nurse. That she wasn't directly involved with the project, but she knew every family in the community who had a child or where the woman was pregnant, and she could actually say, house by house, Senora Rodriguez, participating in the project, is going really well. Her neighbor, Senora Flor, wanted to participate, her husband wouldn't let her. Senora Rodriguez, she's in hospital. And so there, we just sat down with the district nurse. She actually could draw us a map of the 50 houses in the community, could tell us exactly how each of them had been affected by the project. Sometimes the district police chief, if there are issues of gender-based violence and so on, may or may not be able to help you depending on the dynamics. But there are people around, there's NGOs, religious leaders, and so if you plan ahead, even if you've only got, or your consultant's only got limited time in the community, if somebody has set up meetings, but then also reality, you may have to just stay more than 1 day. But planning ahead, there is a lot can get done. And I just spend so much time with evaluation departments where they're telling me why they can't do things. Young man, if you've been around as long as I have, you'd understand that our budget system, we have a rule, you can't spend more than 5 days in the country without getting sign off from our president, and so they just this is always why you couldn't, and so it obviously has to be somebody higher up who says, well, let's experiment doing something a little bit longer. One final thought on that, which is strategically very important. If you're starting to look at unanticipated consequences, try to begin with an evaluation where some of the unanticipated consequences are going to be positive. Because if you just get the image, don't bring these evaluators in, they're going to just cause you all sorts of trouble. Women have ended up in hospital, there's all of these things happening. So try and find a case where, there was an example in Zambia. I was working on a housing project which was classified as having gone very badly because the community was supposed to work together to put in the drainage in the community. And this was when Zambia was a very socialist country, and Sunday mornings all of the families were dragged out by these youth with red flags to come and, there was only about 5 shovels and there was 50 people waiting around to help dig. And so after a while everyone just said, to hell with this, we're not going to waste our time. But having got together, the community said among themselves, without anybody facilitating, what we really want is a clinic. And so the community went out and got the funds for the medicines, built the clinic themselves. The project was classified as a failure because community participation hadn't worked because they didn't build the drains. So that would be an interesting example of showing unanticipated consequences were very positive. So if the first couple you do is negative, no one's ever going to hire you again to look at unanticipated consequences. So sort of think strategically of, you're not just doing public relations, but there may be some bad things, but you could say also, these things were going well. So those are just a few thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Any other points? Otherwise, I have a couple.
Yeah.
Mama, you have a question?
It's interesting that we work for an organization that in a way has been trying to not talk about unintended consequence. And I mean it from the standpoint of it's been only reluctantly and recently that we've moved into the requirement for social and environmental safeguards.
Yes. Yeah.
And whereas the World Bank and others have had these requirements for this for some time, UNDP has now just put that into place with a fairly light screening procedure for projects and programs, where they have to try to consider whether there will be consequences as a result of, in this case, not investment projects, but more capacity building, technical support projects. So it'll be interesting to see whether that gives us, as we move along, a little bit more information in which to try to determine some
Yes.
The other thing that occurs to me from what you were saying that I think is a critical issue for us and quite difficult is that it's also an organization that has been moving more towards upstream strategic planning advice at the country level. And so then when you meet with country directors and you're talking to them about this assessment that you're going to do on their country program, and say, yeah, but you really have to capture this strategic advice that doesn't sit there in a program or project, but in fact relates directly to this discussion I had with the minister the other day. And now they're going to move forward on it, and you have to capture that we've made this accomplishment. And a lot of it is it sounds good, but it's very difficult to see what on the ground kind of impact it's had.
Yes.
So I mean, what you're saying in terms of unintended consequences is certainly very critical for us to capture that.
Yes. Yeah, maybe you don't want to use the word unintended consequences. Maybe a different phrase which makes it more sense.
But they'd like us to talk about unintended achievements.
Yes, right. Yes.
Maybe intended.
Oh yeah, intended, but
not
unprogrammatic,
public.
non-programmatic
Yeah.
achievements.
I just have a couple of points actually, one of the things, some of the issues you've raised here, and I think Mike referred to it, is, in our evaluations, the way we're using national consultants.
Yes.
And unfortunately, I don't think we've gotten to the point to really analyze the value added of using the national consultants. I think we used to have this back to office reports and, we might mention it, but I know in my case, the use of national consultants actually highlighted a number of the points, like they know the country, they know somebody's life, and secondly, they would know actually at the beneficiary level, which I think is something we'd have to reflect on in moving forward. But in a related way to when we're talking about the fact that in our evaluations we're looking at programs, but the foundations of programs is projects. And when we do our ADRs, actually we sample a number of projects or activities to go after. So a lot of the points you've mentioned actually are also valid, because we're taking a sample of projects to actually analyze whether in fact they achieved or not achieved. And at that level we could begin to sort of break down whether it's intended or not. So some of it would apply,
Yes.
You know, it's true UNDP is beginning to do more upscale.
Right, yes.
But we still look at how,
Yes.
of course, the linkage between the upstream and
Yes.
that's still an issue.
Yes.
Outputs and
But
outcomes.
it is true, but on the
Yeah.
other hand, I think it's because in our mind we still think of hard things.
Mhm.
I think these are advocacy, they're part of softer systems.
Yes, yes.
And we haven't fully come to
Yes.
grips with how do you evaluate softer systems.
Yes, yes.
And I think it's a significant part. It's like we never want to look at the behavioral change,
Sure, yes.
but really it's people who change.
Yes,
So I think the paradigm we're using,
yes.
you know, makes us want to not want to look at,
Yes,
here's a policy and its
Yes.
implementation.
yes, yes.
You know, I think those are considerations on
Yes.
our part. But I want to go back to the whole theory of change, because some time back with Michael Bamberger, if you remember, I mean, not Michael, Robert Ian,
Ian.
you remember?
Yes.
He actually coined the word theory of action.
Mhm.
So you're going to be talking about the theory of change, that's fine, that's your program thing. But you have an action going
Yes.
on.
Right, yes.
And the fidelity of implementation or non-implementation,
Yes.
or the consequences,
Yes.
you know, that sort of should serve as the framework,
Yes,
you
yes.
know, that we should be looking at, as
Right.
opposed to the theory of change that programmatic people would have done. So
Yes.
this discussion sort of brings back that
Yeah.
dialogue we
Yeah.
had with Robert Ian,
Yes.
you know, some time back, and he coined the theory of action, and then of course we beat him down with it. And he said, I don't care whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
you know, it's the theory of how things got engineered and what actually happened.
Yes, yes.
And it's not the fidelity of implementation because development changes. So how are you going to now look at something that changed, which means your strategies change,
Mhm.
and perhaps the outcomes might have changed.
Yes,
So how are you
yes.
going to evaluate?
Right,
And,
yes.
and that's a big challenge
Sure,
still.
yes.
And we still look at UNDP outcomes and whether they've met
Yes.
the outcomes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is quite timely.
Yeah, yeah, no, yes.
Can I take building on what you're saying about the projects, you know,
Yeah.
in our ADRs we have, you know, the real world is we have a time constraint and a budget constraint, and in a few cases we've tried to get down to the communities and the beneficiaries, and of course it normally delays us, and maybe we need to give more time to be able to do this properly.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, as Sukai says, we build on existing projects, and when I look at this thing, this actually we need to put in the guidance for the people who are undertaking the project guidelines.
Mhm.
You know, if we're undertaking the project evaluations. But at the same time, we need to get, as you know, evaluation officers need to get our hands dirty. And this has been discussed before, that we need to actually get back involved in doing project evaluations.
Yeah.
Because I think doing ADRs and thematics, we're losing sight of some of these very practical, important issues of how to work with beneficiaries and so on, the
Yes.
companies you're bringing up here. And I think that's something that we need to address and get some practical experience before we can help in the guidance for our colleagues to do these things.
Mm.
Because I think the theory of change, if you're looking at some policy change, if you sort of spell down the different levels, you know, the policy change is supposed to be producing some effects at different levels, which
Yes.
you could try to measure. And, you know, if the policy doesn't have any detectable changes at any level,
Mm.
you know, you begin to wonder.
Right, I mean, I think the policy stuff we tend to
Yes.
do okay with
Yes.
with the ADRs, but it's these fewer and fewer, but still nonetheless often very big
Yeah.
projects dealing with directly with, you know, poverty reduction, local
Right.
governance and so on,
Yes.
that we really fail. Either we end up being development tourists and popping in and speaking to the village leader and so on, you know, which
Yes.
is all we have time to do.
Yes.
Or we just hope and pray that someone else has given us some feedback, which is often self-assessment by the cultural
Yes.
officers themselves,
Yes.
which is normally
Yeah.
of course, strongly biased.
Yes.
But what's what you say about the excuse of complexity is for not satisfying is, you know, it really resonates. I mean, you know, we do very few evaluations, you know, as an organisation beyond, you know, outside us, and we know from recent assessments that only 20% are actually satisfactory, and that you know we will tell you how many people participate in a microfinance scheme,
Yes.
but we won't tell you what happened after that.
Yes.
We will say that we published an NDG report on time,
Yes.
but how that affected everything down the line, no one knows. It's too difficult. It's not. You can't attribute to us. It's done. So we don't bother, and we have very little knowledge about what difference we're making to people.
Right. Yes. Yes.
It's a shame.
One interesting sort of area which is quite complex and sensitive is working with civil society, in the sense that there's many organisations working in the communities where UNDP has projects. Now they all have their own sort of bias and axe to grind, but there's just lots of people, lots of organisations who know a great deal about what it is you like to know at the grassroots level. And I've been working, one of the things I've been focusing on with working on mixed method evaluation, is one of the big challenges is that many of these NGOs use more qualitative methods, sort of case studies and so on. And very often the results they come up with, it's very difficult to know how well they can be generalized. You know, there was an example of helping develop a gender strategy for Morocco, and we were looking at the health sector, and the Ministry of Health had done an evaluation, a survey, and women were using the rural health centres. They brought in an NGO and documented very well in a small number of communities that many women weren't using the rural health centres because there were issues of sexual harassment and a lack of respect for women who didn't speak French. And the Ministry of Health obviously didn't like this, but they just said, no, this is not representative. And the NGO was not able to respond to that because they were basically preparing cases in the communities where they had contacts. And so there's huge amounts of very valuable insights from NGOs or from consultants doing qualitative work, which just gets not used because it wasn't selected in any kind of systematic way, so you don't know how representative it is. In many countries it's a big issue because there's relations between NGOs and government is not very good in a lot of countries, so women's organisations are quite likely to be trying to criticise the government in a way which may not be completely fair. They may be selecting cases and so on. So I think thinking how NGOs or more generally people using qualitative methods, how you can link that into sample survey frameworks so that you can select villages or households which are broadly representative. So you can say, these are not just the poorest women, or they're not just with a certain orientation. I think that would just be very beneficial because why NGO evaluations are sensitive is because they're really on the ground in its specifics. If you do a survey across the country and 23% of people didn't like your program, no one really cares. But if it's saying in this village, the women don't like Dr. Rodriguez because, or the district governor or whatever, that's very specific, and it's a particular person. So working with NGOs on these kind of things is, I think it's a huge resource. If you just sort of think that in almost any country, there's lots of organisations know most of the stuff which you'd like to get at the community level, but you don't have the resources to get down there. So how can you sort of channel this? It means working with government to broaden their focus on, because a lot of governments like to use participatory methods, but under their control. You involve the good guys to do participation, but not these terrible women's organisations who keep criticising and sort of thing, whatever. So, but it's just a huge resource if you can, and that's going to work better in Brazil than it may in some other countries and so on. But it's something to think about. And I've just seen many studies, boxes and boxes of case studies that just the quantitative people just don't know what to do with this. Even if it's not that they're afraid it's too critical. It's just we do a national survey with 25,000 interviews saying people in general are getting richer in India. Somebody does 50 case studies saying all the families feel they're worse off. What do you do with this? It's just 50 cases as opposed to 25,000. So normally you go through and you get one or two nice little cute quotes which you put in, and that's it. So I think that's really a very challenging area to if one can get a handle on that. Many of these NGOs would do this stuff for you practically free if they're advocacy. Now, if they're advocacy, that means they're trying to advocate something, and where does the bias come in? But if you bring the triangulation out of your toolbox and check 2 or 3 different sources, the key informants agree with what the NGOs say, and you can begin to get some handle. And then maybe if there really are very different perspectives coming from different sources, maybe that's where you try and get some funds to do a more detailed study. But my guess is in a lot of areas you just find there's a reasonable degree of consensus that these rural roads are not more participatory than they were before, because and that may be something you find out quite cheaply and not too So anyway, it's a thought.
Good one.
We still have time? Yeah, it's the end of it. Yeah. It's about 12? Well, Michael, 2 now. Yeah. Indra, you want to say a word?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Michael. I had the good fortune of having dinner with Michael last night. So we shared thoughts, and I'm quite sure that we will continue to be associated with the office. Where's the book, Sasha? I'm just trying to work out how many pages are there on that book. Michael, despite his hectic schedule, still manages to write for us and to advance the discipline of evaluation with others.
The chapter 16 on the evaluating complex programs, that's, I don't know, 30 pages, that would be
Yes.
copyable, not if you wanted to.
Yes. Yes. No, thank you very much for
But if you wanted.
yes, but also we sort of just had a little mini IPTED presented here today. That's how I got to know Michael actually, so about 5 years ago when we were teaching in Canada. Thank you for sharing your expertise and thoughts with us. It's been most useful. We will continue to engage, and be quite sure to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Just
much.
one example of unintended consequences of us having supper, you missed seeing your president.
Yes.
So that's it.
That was the slight problem we had yesterday. But I think I don't want to lose out on the thoughts that you shared, which were much better than the
Well,
other thoughts.
thank
that
you
I've
for
got.
inviting me. It's always, I always enjoy working with your evaluation group. There's lots of very experienced people with lots of interesting ideas and lots of challenging things to try to evaluate. So thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.